The gilded cage was collapsing. As the Third Reich crumbled, the wives of its architects found their stolen world vanishing, their toasts to victory replaced by the taste of ash. With their husbands dead or captured and defeat clawing at the door, there was nowhere left to run. By the final week of April in 1945, Berlin was a city undone. The Red Army had torn deep into its heart, and the percussive rhythm of artillery strikes became its final shuddering heartbeat. A perpetual twilight of smoke and dust choked the sky, veiling entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble as water, power, and food disappeared. Beneath the cratered garden of the Reich Chancellery, the Führerbunker offered a final desperate refuge. Here, Adolf Hitler and his most loyal followers hid from the apocalypse they had created. Built to withstand the heaviest bombs, its thick concrete walls and narrow passages were lit by dim, unsteady lamps, the air thick with stale cigarette smoke and the damp chill of confinement. Within this concrete tomb, everyone understood the end was near. Hitler, secluded in the lower levels, had become a specter of his former self, his days lost to sleeplessness and fits of rage. Reports from the front confirmed only the totality of Germany's defeat, and a creeping fear infected his staff, their whispered conversations punctuated by the muffled thunder from the world above. On the 29th of April, in a grim, hurried ceremony, Hitler married Eva Braun, the woman who had remained a shadow throughout his years of power. Witnessed by a handful of aides, including Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, the wedding was a surreal prelude to the end. That same night, Hitler dictated his final political testament, blaming betrayal for his failure and vowing he would never be taken alive. The following afternoon, on April 30th, Hitler and his new bride retreated into the quiet of his private study. Eva Braun bit down on a capsule of cyanide. Hitler raised a pistol to his right temple and pulled the trigger. Their bodies were discovered moments later, wrapped in blankets, and carried up into the garden. As the smell of gunpowder mingled with the smoke of the burning city, their remains were consumed by flames just meters from the advancing Soviet soldiers. The air in the bunker grew thick with a suffocating finality. But another, more intimate horror was unfolding in its deepest chambers, a tragedy born of fanaticism and despair. Magda Goebbels, wife of the propaganda minister, had sought refuge here weeks before, bringing her 6 children with her. They were a stark, innocent contrast to the surrounding ruin, ranging in age from just 4 to 12. For Magda, a life without Hitler was an unthinkable void, a reality she refused to let her children endure. Her devotion was absolute, a chilling resolve that masqueraded as maternal protection. Amidst the tremors of a collapsing city, she maintained an eerie calm, dressing her children in clean clothes each day. This desperate performance of normalcy did little to soothe the bunker staff, who watched the children play with a heavy, unspoken knowledge of what was to come. On the evening of May 1st, 1945, that unspoken future arrived. With the assistance of SS Dr. Ludwig Stumpfaker, Magda and Joseph Goebbels prepared for their final act. The children were first given a sleeping draft, their descent into unconsciousness a prelude to the end. One by one, Magda moved through the small sleeping quarters, placing a cyanide capsule in each child's mouth and crushing it between their teeth. All 6 died in their beds, their small bodies lying still in the suffocating silence. Later that night, Joseph and Magda ascended to the Chancellery Garden, a wasteland of rubble and smoke. A single pistol shot ended her life, followed by another that silenced him forever. Their bodies, discovered soon after, were burned near the very same crater where the remains of Hitler and Eva Braun had been consumed by fire just the day before. The air underground grew thin, heavy with the dust of a dying city. With each tremor, the bunker walls seemed to shrink as the sounds of Soviet tanks and artillery fire moved from the horizon to the street just overhead. Outside on the Wilhelmstrasse, the world had been reduced to a tangled ruin of burned-out vehicles and rubble, a desolate landscape under a sky of smoke. Within this concrete tomb, all connection to the world had been severed. The telephones were dead, the radios silent. As dwindling supplies and stale air tightened their grip, some officers whispered of a desperate breakout, while others simply sat in stunned resignation. For many, the end had already come, delivered by a cyanide capsule or a self-inflicted gunshot. Above ground, on the 2nd of May, the symbolic fall of Berlin was complete as Soviet forces raised their flag over the shattered dome of the Reichstag. With Hitler's inner circle now dead, scattered, or captured, a wave of despair rippled across the country. Among generals, SS officers, and their families, a final grim reckoning began. In southern Germany, Lena Heydrich, the widow of SS leader Reinhard Heydrich, assassinated in Prague in 1942, felt the approaching shadow of retribution. Her privileged life, funded by the state since her husband's death, was now a liability. Fearing both Czech partisans and the advancing Soviets, she made a choice not to flee the country, but to erase the past. She burned letters, files, and any paper linking her husband to the Gestapo, then took her children and vanished, seeking refuge on the remote northern island of Fehmarn. Meanwhile, in the port city of Kiel, the German Navy's remaining leadership was collapsing. On May 3, 1945, General Hans-Georg von Friedeburg surrendered the entire Kriegsmarine to the British. Hours later, his wife, whose name was never entered into public record, took her own life. For her, the fall of her husband's command was the end of all things. 20 days later, upon learning he was to face war crimes investigators, von Friedeburg himself followed her into the dark. The reckoning had begun, quiet and methodical. In the town of Stendal, northeast of Magdeburg, American troops came for Margareta Speer, wife of Hitler's notorious minister for armaments. She was not harmed or charged, but her husband's name cast a long, dark shadow, making the arrest a grave matter. U.S. forces separated Margareta from her children, meticulously searched her home, and subjected her to grueling hours of interrogation. They pressed her for any detail, any overheard conversation from her husband's time at the heart of the Nazi war machine. Through it all, Margareta offered only silence. Her old life was over. A new, uncertain existence had just begun. This scene, however, was a microcosm of a far darker drama unfolding across the broken Reich. From towns like Neustrelitz to the shattered suburbs of Berlin, a wave of self-destruction was cresting. In the small town of Demmin alone, a horrifying spectacle played out over just a few days as nearly 900 people, mostly women and children, took their own lives. They waded into the cold waters of the Peene River, while others turned to poison, to the blade, or to the consuming finality of fire. These were not all high-ranking officials, but ordinary citizens bound by fear. Whispers of the approaching Red Army, of looting, violence, and vengeance had become a storm of terror, and for many, suicide seemed the only escape. For the wives of the Nazi elite, self-destruction became a final twisted act of fidelity. Some were consumed by a belief that they had failed their Führer, while others had so deeply internalized the regime's ideology that a world without it was simply unbearable. To them, surrender was disgrace, and a public trial was a humiliation worse than death. In towns long dominated by the SS, entire families chose to perish together, with wives pleading for a merciful end before the enemy arrived. By the first week of May, the German landscape was scarred not only by bombs and battles, but by thousands of freshly dug graves, each one a silent testament to guilt, to terror, and to a loyalty that had consumed everything. In the ruins of a fallen empire, the silence was heavy with unspoken questions. With Germany's formal surrender on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe was over, but the reckoning was only just beginning. Across the continent, a vast and methodical hunt was launched by the Allied powers, a search for former Nazi officials, SS officers, and the families who had stood by them. While many of the highest-ranking perpetrators were already dead or had vanished, their wives often remained. They were found secluded in remote homes, isolated castles, and quiet mountain villages, surrounded by the fading luxury of a defeated regime. Allied investigators saw these women as more than just spouses. They were potential keys to uncovering hidden networks, concealed documents, and stolen wealth. Even if not directly criminal, they were considered essential witnesses to a history that now had to be judged. One of the first to be taken into custody was Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, the man who had been Hitler's deputy before his doomed flight to Scotland in 1941. While her husband spent the war as a British prisoner, Ilse remained a committed figure within Nazi society, attending meetings and championing its causes. In late May of 1945, United States troops found her in southern Bavaria and placed her under arrest, convinced she had never abandoned her fervent beliefs. After her detention, Ilse Hess was released but not forgiven. She was banned from public life, forbidden from owning land, publishing political works, or speaking at events. Her children were watched, and her life became a quiet, monitored existence, a testament to a loyalty that had outlived the state it served. That same June, Allied soldiers ascended into the Austrian Alps, arriving at the gates of Fischhorn Castle. There, they captured Emmy Göring, the wife of the Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, a woman who had lived with the opulence of a queen. She had been draped in the finest clothes, a constant presence at Hitler's side, residing in mansions filled with priceless art and furniture. Her arrest was the first tremor of a coming earthquake. Shortly after, her husband surrendered and was sent to stand trial at Nuremberg. Emmy was taken to a detention center, separated from her young daughter and stripped of her vast belongings. The people who had once revered her now turned away or openly called her a criminal. When she was finally released in 1948, she was no longer an icon of elegance, but a permanent fixture of a disgraced past, living out her days under government supervision in Munich, a world away from the power she had once known. Investigators also focused on Else von Greifenberg, the wife of SS General Karl Wolff, a man who had worked closely with Himmler and managed communications between Hitler and the SS. In the final months of the war, her husband had secretly negotiated the surrender of German forces in Italy through Operation Sunrise, one of the first clandestine deals between the Nazis and the Allies. Elsa, they believed, might know the details of these hidden talks. Arrested in June 1945, she was brought to a camp near Munich, where she claimed to have been a simple housewife, entirely ignorant of politics. Yet documents told a different story, revealing her attendance at high-profile SS events and her close friendships with the wives of other top officials. Though never charged, she was not permitted to return to her former estate, her property seized by occupation forces. Her husband avoided execution for his cooperation, and together they receded into a quiet life in Bavaria, far from the public eye. Elsa passed away in the early 1970s, a forgotten player in a drama whose final act was still being written. As the dust of a fallen empire settled, a different kind of reckoning began. By the summer of 1945, Allied detention camps were swelling with the women of the Third Reich, the wives, sisters, and daughters of its defeated leaders, gathered from every corner of Germany and Austria. They were plucked from idyllic mountain retreats like the Berghof, and from the manicured grounds of military bases, their lives of privilege abruptly ending. Inside the camps, they faced days of relentless questioning. Interrogators probed for what they had seen, what they truly knew, and whether they had helped conceal the regime's stolen treasures or its wanted men. From sprawling American facilities in Augsburg and Regensburg to French compounds in Metz and British sites in Lower Saxony, a network of internment held them fast. Their former world had evaporated into smoke and memory. Life inside was a stark reversal of fortune. The women were stripped of their fine clothes and forced into plain uniforms, their lavish meals replaced by basic rations under strict military discipline. Some were confined to isolation, while others were housed with strangers, forbidden from contacting what remained of their families. While not all were guilty of crimes, nearly all had basked in the warmth of Nazi power, living in grand homes seized from Jewish families and attending opulent parties as the continent burned. Even for those released after a few months, true freedom remained elusive. They were barred from voting, teaching, or holding government positions, their names placed on blacklists. Watched by the new German police or Allied forces, many could not leave their home districts without permission. Former friends vanished, social positions dissolved, and in the quiet ruin of their lives, many lost their homes and even their children. In the ruins of the Third Reich, vengeance wore a human face. For the women who had stood beside the architects of the Nazi regime, and for their children, a terrible reckoning was at hand, especially from the East. The Red Army, having endured the scorched earth of the German invasion, advanced with a rage that was personal and deeply unforgiving. In their eyes, the wives of Nazi leaders were not merely spouses of powerful men. They were living symbols of the ideology that had brutalized their people and desecrated their homeland. Hedwig Rosenberg, wife of the party's chief racial theorist, Alfred Rosenberg, was in Königsberg when the Soviets arrived. Captured in May of 1945, she was transported to a prison deep within Soviet territory. Though her husband was already in American hands, her captors sought to break her spirit. For more than 2 years, she was held in a freezing cell, denied medical care, and fed just enough to survive. Upon her release in 1947, she found no home to return to. Königsberg had been annexed and renamed Kaliningrad. Elsewhere, in countless occupied towns, other women connected to the Nazi leadership faced a more public fury. Wives, secretaries, and female relatives of SS officers were dragged into the streets, where crowds of civilians unleashed their own grief and anger. Some were stripped and had their hair shorn, while others were beaten before being handed to Soviet guards. These were not official military orders, but in the chaos of a continent torn apart, they were allowed to happen. In the eyes of their captors, these women were not prisoners of war, but enemies of the people, their rights erased, their fates often left unrecorded. Beyond the glare of the trial's floodlights, a different kind of judgment was unfolding in the shadows. While the world watched images of unspeakable horror from the camps, the wives of the accused lived in a state of guarded isolation, their own fate suspended in the balance. Not far from the courtroom, in a secure house under the unblinking watch of American military guards, Hermann Göring's wife, Emmy, endured a lonely vigil. Her repeated requests to visit her husband in his cell were consistently denied, leaving her to pace the perimeter of the prison grounds. Dressed in dark clothing and sunglasses, she would linger in the shadows of the courthouse, a ghost hoping for a glimpse, desperate to avoid the eyes of reporters and the scorn of civilians. The letters she wrote were her only lifeline, yet most were heavily censored or simply never reached him. She was not even granted the dignity of being informed of his final sentence. When Hermann Göring was condemned to death on October 1st, 1946, the news never officially reached her. She would only learn of his fate after he had already taken his own life with cyanide, just hours before his scheduled execution on the night of October 15th. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler's wife, Margareta, was held in a nearby military facility, her husband's suicide in May 1945, doing little to lessen her importance to the Allies. Investigators considered her a crucial witness and questioned her repeatedly. Even as the court heard overwhelming evidence of the SS's crimes, she clung to the fiction that her husband had been a good man, insisting in written statements that she knew nothing of concentration camps or mass executions. This denial strained credulity, especially given the privileged life she had led among the SS elite. After months of surveillance, Margareta was released in early 1946, but freedom proved to be its own prison. Hounded by threats from German civilians, she was forced to change her name and vanish from public life, rarely seen by neighbors and never speaking of her past. She died in 1967 without an obituary or any official recognition, her silence as absolute as the grave. The experience of Margareta Speer, however, followed a different path. Her husband, Albert, was one of the few defendants to accept a measure of guilt, admitting moral responsibility for the use of forced labor. After he was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison, she was granted a single brief meeting in a secure visitors area. The encounter was cold and formal. She could not bring her children, and any discussion of politics was forbidden. Once his sentence was confirmed, she returned home to the crushing weight of raising their children alone, forever branded by her husband's association with Hitler. For years, German authorities monitored her movements as she navigated a life of limited means and constant stigma. When Albert was finally released in 1966, she quietly supported his re-entry into society. But while he wrote books and courted public interest, she remained firmly in the shadows. After his death in 1981, she continued her quiet existence in Heidelberg, passing away in 1987, remembered only by a few. In the ruins of the Third Reich, a chilling silence descended upon the women who had once stood at its center. After the Nuremberg trials delivered their verdicts in 1946, the wives of Germany's fallen leaders awoke to a world shattered, their nation divided, and their cities reduced to fields of rubble. For these women, stripped of their former power, survival was a daily battle against suspicion and scorn. They were ghosts of a hated regime, met with cold stares and closed doors. Work was denied, and their infamous names clung to them like a shroud, barring any return to normalcy. On the windswept island of Fehmarn, Lena Heydrich purchased a farmhouse, converting it into a small guest house to support her family. But the locals knew who she was, and her children often bore the brunt of that legacy, isolated and taunted at school. Through the 1950s and beyond, Lena waged a futile campaign to redeem her husband's name. In a series of interviews, she insisted he was merely a loyal soldier who had followed orders, deflecting his central role in orchestrating the Holocaust at the Wannsee Conference. Until her death in 1985, she offered no remorse, her denial as unyielding as the North Sea wind. Emmy Goering, once the glamorous First Lady of the Reich, returned to Munich with nothing. The Allies had confiscated her vast estates, her art, and her jewels, leaving her a penniless outcast. Her attempts to publish memoirs were met with rejection, her identity forever fused with the regime she once represented. She lived modestly in a small apartment, a specter of her former self who rarely appeared in public and never granted a full interview, passing away in 1973 without public ceremony. But not all chose obscurity. Ilse Hess reacted with defiance, remaining fiercely loyal to her husband's memory and becoming a prominent voice in Germany's resurgent far-right circles. Through nationalist magazines, she defended Hitler and recast Rudolf Hess as a failed peacemaker, unjustly imprisoned in Spandau. Banned from political events, she continued her crusade until her death in 1995, a testament to an ideology that refused to die. For the other wives, the post-war years offered a similar fate of poverty and rejection. Some changed their names, others retreated to the quiet anonymity of the countryside, but none would ever re-enter public life. Their husbands had steered a nation into catastrophe, and they were left alone to carry the immense weight of that inheritance. Their children, desperate to escape the stain, scattered across the globe to the United States, Canada, and South America, many shedding their infamous surnames forever. By the close of the 20th century, nearly all of these women were gone, their deaths passing largely unnoticed. No monuments were built for them, no honors bestowed. Their lives, which had begun in the gilded cage of power and privilege, ended in the quiet shadows of shame, defiance, or denial, living footnotes in a chapter of history that Germany was desperate to forget.